Hi everyone, well good afternoon and welcome to this techUK webinar on cloud computing and digital transformation in the public sector. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Hazel and I'm techUK's Cloud Computing Programme Manager. This session is part of techUK's annual Cloud Computing Campaign Week, and there'll be a link in the chat in a moment or down below on the page if you're watching this as a webinar. We've got lots of great content going out this week, so please do check that out. A couple of quick housekeeping points before we get started. The session is being recorded and it will be distributed as a webinar, so please keep an eye out for the link and share it with any colleagues that couldn't attend today. We are going to be taking questions from the chat, so put any questions or comments that you've got there and I'll do my best to put them to the panel, or the panelists can just pick them up themselves. But please do keep your cameras off and your microphones muted if they're not already, to avoid disruption. If you add a question also, please can you try and remember to say who you are and what organisation you're from, just to give a bit of context for the panel when they answer. So we've got a great panel today and they can introduce themselves much better than I can. So Aislinn, Johnny, David and Aaron, perhaps do you want to just introduce yourself and say a little bit about your organisation?
Ladies first.
Hey. Thanks very much, Jonathan. Thanks, Chris. I'm delighted to be here today and join in the conversation. I am Aislinn McBride. I'm the CTO at Kainos. Kainos is a services organisation largely delivering digital across the UK. You'll have used our services if you have used the likes of the NHS app or renewed your passport. A lot of the large scale public sector services we've been part of delivering. We are a 3,000 person strong organisation, mainly across the UK, but also in North America and other parts of smaller offices across the globe.
Thanks, Aislinn. Johnny?
Hey everyone, thanks a lot for your time. So I'm Johnny. I work for KPMG in the UK. KPMG being a global brand, I work for the UK area of it. We are an auditing company and a tax company, but we also do some incredible work in consulting, which is where I sit. My roles and responsibilities are to look after the public sector cloud practice, which takes into account advising, designing, building and running cloud infrastructure natively, or also software that sits on cloud. So I've been here for about 8 years or so now, very much from an engineering background, moving much more into client-facing and public sector aligned. So great to meet everybody.
Thanks. David?
Thanks, Chris. Great to be on the panel this afternoon. Welcome to everybody that's joined us. My name's David Price. I'm a public sector specialist for Rackspace. Rackspace have been providing cloud solutions for organisations of all sizes all over the world since 1998. Half of our business is public cloud, the other half private cloud. We own 38 data centres across the world. And 2 months ago, we launched a sovereign private cloud in the UK. So very, very much focused on working with the public sector around their cloud strategies. 2 years ago, we also signed a global deal with BT to be their partner of choice for cloud. So we work very closely with BT, who provide lots of our cloud connectivity and our security solutions. So delighted to be on the call this afternoon, Chris.
Thanks, David. And Aaron, if you're there.
Yeah, hi, Chris, assuming I'm still not on camera. My name's Aaron Neal. I'm the head of public sector Oracle Cloud. I've been with Oracle for 4 months. Prior to that, I had 15 years experience at AWS and Microsoft. So broad spectrum of cloud providers over this time.
Thanks, Aaron. Well, it's great to have you all here. I've got a few questions to get the conversation going, and then after about 25, 30 minutes or so, we'll take some questions from the chat. So if you're watching, please do comment along. So I thought I'd start out with just kind of a bit of a general scene setting question. Perhaps, Aislinn, I'll come to you first. Where do all of you see the key opportunities for cloud-enabled digital transformation for the public sector? Thinking not just in terms of IaaS, but PaaS or SaaS and the kind of broader cloud offering.
I think the big thing that we see public sector getting from adopting the cloud is the flexibility of being able to adopt a really flexible approach to their services, adopting to new regulations, changes in their environment, changes to the expectations of residents across the UK. When you adopt the cloud, it gives you the ability to to pivot really quickly and to understand your estate more clearly. I think that's been the fundamental of how we've seen cloud over the past 5 or 6 years, and where we've seen those benefits. Where that's developing and changing now, and we're seeing more opportunity on top of that, is just the level of variety of the services that are available now in the cloud is phenomenal. The accessibility to AI services, by way of example, is unreal. They're really leading edge. With properly adopting the cloud, government departments are able to try those things, fail really quickly, test out ideas, and serve their needs better, advance much more quickly, which is fantastic to see. And that, I think that's a big opportunity for government. And then the other overlay that we're starting to see more of, and that would be keen certainly for government to adopt more, is seeing their sustainability agenda through this as well. You look at the impact whenever you move to the cloud, not just by way of cost, but by way of carbon as well. Adopted well and efficiently, the level of difference that we've seen is absolutely phenomenal. A really good example of that is with the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. They went through a massive migration whenever the Taliban seized power in Afghanistan. We worked with them to move 700 virtual machines across 3 continents into cloud-based environments. And you can imagine just how quickly that pivot had to happen. But that was part of a much bigger journey that they went on. It's not just about moving virtual machines. They then, as a result of that move and more widely embracing the cloud, had a 92% reduction in their carbon emissions through that. That's huge. If you apply that across government, the level of impact there is phenomenal. They furthered that journey by developing a data platform. They started off, as I would say, data rich but information poor. To go from that to being able to forecast and use predictive analytics to deliver a much richer service is phenomenal. They really embraced the cloud, not just delivering a service, but thinking about what that meant for their organization, allowing them to scale, be more secure, have that performance that they need, and scale up as needed. And to achieve that, I think for us, certainly a huge part of that is the education piece. It's really easy to see this just as a technology, but actually the organization shifted to embrace this technology, to be nimble with the technology, to use those foresights, to challenge actually how they were working as an organization, and doing that in partnership with Kainos. So I think we need to go beyond this just being a technology and thinking about it as an organizational shift, getting that sustainability benefit, getting that nimbleness within your organization, and all of the innovation that can come with that. You're on mute there, Chris.
Cool. Yeah, that's definitely one of the threads that comes out of our lots of our kind of cloud events is that broader organizational change component. Johnny, do you want to come in here in terms of kind of some scene setting around opportunities for public sector? Aislinn gave a really good international example there. I'm going to be interested if you've got any kind of UK-based examples.
Yeah, so just to build on what was said before, really, I think it's going back to basics as well around the real pull originally for moving to cloud was not only the flexibility, which is absolutely true, but also cost. And what I'm seeing in the market, particularly in government, there's some really good examples of how organizations or departments have shifted their culture, shifted their mindset much more into how to adopt cloud in the best way. But there are some examples as well where that's not happened. So lifting and shifting and expecting for your tech estate to be cheaper than what it was, you're probably going to get a big shock because it's not going to be. So I do still think there are some benefits that have not been realized by some government departments to take advantage of the true value of cloud, which is probably doing more either for the same price or a little bit less. So taking advantage of native technology, so you can pass on that responsibility back to the cloud service providers, and you can free up that time and resource and that budget to go and spend on innovation or enriching features of the service that you're actually supporting or providing for citizens or patients or whomever it might be. Some of the things I always try and help our clients with on this journey is around accountability and visibility. So if you can't see what you're building, if you can't kind of demonstrate what you have under your control, and it's really difficult to kind of measure, to track, and then improve. So technical debt is always one that I try and keep an eye on. I'm from Yorkshire, so it's probably beaten into me from a DNA perspective. Be careful with your money. So I think it's helped me try and explain that to clients around, you're spending X million on this thing. Are you really getting the value for that? And actually being able to see that data is really important, and pushing that responsibility right onto the engineers, onto the developers, as part of their, why am I building this thing? Why am I writing this line of code, for example? Why am I building this cloud native thing? To really understand what the benefits are for the citizen or for the patient. Good example, it's not a KPMG example, but it was a really good read a few years ago around how Home Office have adapted some FinOps principles, some fairly basic FinOps principles, but it's drastically reduced their overall spend by around 40% from their AWS spend. And it's simple things like right sizing components, making sure auto scaling is baked into architectural decisions. So meeting the demand. So going back to the earlier point around flexibility, paying for what you need at that point, and then not paying for the things you don't need overnight, for example, and then re-architecting using that serverless capability. So again, not looking after IaaS infrastructure anymore and trying to adopt more SaaS or PaaS services has always, in my experience, shown the true value of cloud. Opinion.
Well, I'm sure that those FinOps professionals you were talking about really appreciate your northern frugality that you're referring to there. David, does that resonate across with your experience?
It does, Chris. I've been working with the public sector for 25 years, and I understand across that time that public sector folks, particularly in the IT space, want to sweat assets. In the commercial space, you're normally looking at a kind of 3-year refresh cycle for technology. Public sector space, it could be 5 years, 7 years sometimes, and even longer. The reality of that is that if what you're looking at is the cost of that refresh, and therefore trying to sweat those assets as long as you can, the longer you sweat the asset, the more expensive it is to maintain that infrastructure. And I think one of the things that cloud delivers for me, and I'll come on to a customer example in a minute, is that ability to sit on an evergreen platform. It's the cloud service provider's responsibility to make sure that the technology that your applications, your important applications are sitting on, your data is sitting on, is constantly evolving, is constantly being refreshed, and that technology is at the cutting edge of technology, as opposed to being 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. So for me, cloud enables people to have an infrastructure platform that they can use themselves without having to maintain that underlying platform that sits underneath it. So that's a huge advantage in public sector. An example of that would be a local borough council that we worked with some time ago, who literally had data centers that were crumbling. They had severe problems with the buildings that their data centers were in, and really wanted to get out of that data center space, and approached us and said, look, could you move everything in our data center to the cloud? That highlighted one of the other challenges that we see quite often, which is that people that are traditionally used to architecting data centers and technology in data centers tend to look at cloud architecture in the same way they look at their own data center infrastructure. And the council example was a classic example of that, where they said, look, can you just lift and shift this into a cloud platform? And of course, the answer to that is yes. But where an awful lot of people go wrong is they do that mirroring of what they have in their data center in a cloud platform. And of course, they see an initial spike in cost of doing so. I think in the case of the council, because they wanted us to move them very quickly, we weren't enabled to do that analysis up front so that we could re-architect it for the cloud platform. So initially, they saw a spike of about 50% in cost. Over time, with the rationalization of that infrastructure, the costs went down dramatically. The point I guess I'm trying to bring forward is the fact that there very often aren't the skills in public sector organizations to be able to architect something in a cloud platform. So working with the right partner to do that, I think, is really, really important, because otherwise it won't deliver the value that you think it's going to deliver. And certainly the removal of technology debt is something that we talk about all the time. because if you're on those constant refresh cycles, you're constantly having to budget to refresh the infrastructure that you're operating. So I think that's a really good use of cloud, is to replace one with the other. But I think the biggest challenge, given that the public sector and the government have had a cloud-first strategy since 2013, is that there still isn't the skills base in the wider public sector away from the centre to be able to really get the value out of cloud that people could do. But again, I think that's down to partnership and choosing the right people to work with.
Thanks, David. I think you've raised a couple of really interesting points there that we can tease out in some of the subsequent questions, particularly that point that we also were touching on in the event yesterday about the kind of difference between, you know, the amount of cloud adoption that is lift and shift and IaaS, as opposed to the amount of cloud adoption which is actually leveraging some of the kind of platform and software capabilities and cloud native and application modernization to change the way that you're doing business. Aaron, before we move on to the next round of questions, do you just want to come in on kind of your perspective in terms of opportunities for public sector in kind of particularly thinking about the theme of the week and productivity and efficiency and kind of getting more bang for the buck in the public sector?
Yeah, sure. And many good points have already been covered. The one opportunity that really springs to mind for me is the ability to centralize data to harness the use of AI and analytics capabilities, the ability to bring data to the compute and effectively pre-trained models that are available in the cloud. A great example of this from an Oracle perspective is NHS Business Services Authority, that's established a data analytics learning laboratory, or DAL. And effectively, they're using anomaly detection to discover where there might be evidence of inappropriate behavior, for example, from dentist claims. And within the first 3 months of operation, they identified circa £100 million in potential savings that they could follow up with through their commissioners. So certainly the ability to harness and go after data and drive insight from data, I think, is a key opportunity. The final one that I mentioned, because I don't think others mentioned, was increasing security posture. So cloud providers invest billions of dollars, pounds into providing secure environments, operating, putting in technology that can secure environments, compared to some of the investments that are made within UK government. And I think that's something that again is perhaps overlooked from time to time in terms of the value that public sector can get out of adopting cloud at scale.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Aaron. Before we go on to talk about some of the challenges, you've all already started to tease out some of the challenges the public sector is facing. But I'm just wondering, a lot of the theme for this week in Cloud Week is kind of productivity, and a lot of those conversations tend to lean towards the cost saving and efficiency angle of productivity and less the kind of value add. So I'm just wondering, Johnny, perhaps I'll come back to you first on this question, because you mentioned earlier the actual service that the citizen is getting. So I wonder if we could just have a quick round across the panel on where you see opportunities for cloud and other technologies delivered through cloud, so perhaps AI, to enhance the quality of public services, not just make the IT function more efficient. Obviously, that is needed in public sector, but are there opportunities to deliver higher quality or more innovative public services to the end user, which is all of us?
Yeah. So I was going to try and get through the call without mentioning AI, but I think AI is clearly going to be one of those factors. But it's kind of just to kind of like combat the question, really, because I do think if we are freeing up, the back office time and effort and IT, it's freeing up that time to then spend on innovating new things. And going back to David's point, for example, a council, lifting and shifting, spending then the time to transform what they've lifted and shifted, and that will then have a positive impact on the citizen or patient or whoever it might be aimed at. And I still think that from a market perspective, from a sector perspective, that IT is still seen as this necessary evil, where you kind of have to pay these people to kind of keep the lights flashing and keep things going. But if you look at not public sector, Monzo, Starling, Netflix, Airbnb, these are not banks or video rental kind of companies. These are software companies, and the developers themselves, the tech people themselves, quite a lot of people on this call, no doubt, have actually enabled that transformation in their own sector. So it'll be great to see that shift in mindset as to the people enabling this, this cloud stuff and then the capabilities in the cloud are actually enabling those better outcomes for users or for customers or for citizens or for patients. And on the AI thread, I see that as a massive support mechanism, I think, currently for technical staff and for non-technical staff to adopt to help the productivity increase within any given role, really. So if you're a developer using Copilot to help you document your code correctly and efficiently and to the great level of information that we need in there, that's a fantastic use case of how we can adopt AI tools and technologies baked into these cloud services to be more productive. And that will then, of course, I think, pass through onto the citizen in due course.
I think that's a great point, and it kind of combats the traditional view of, you often hear people talk about efficiency savings in government, and that can often be seen as cutting headcount and cutting, particularly if you're coming at it from a kind of old school treasury perspective. So it's interesting to see you frame it as actually this efficiency saving is about value adding elsewhere. Aislinn, can I come back to you on this question around kind of the service that the citizen sees at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think is worth reflecting on whenever you look at the more advanced services in the cloud, particularly AI, is I think you need to reimagine the sky is no longer the limit. We can think much more freely whenever we think about the breadth, think about what we can do with services. They can add such a breadth of value that we never had before. And I think that then leads to departments being able to take quite a different approach to how they deliver. It's no longer, this is what the technology can give us. We're much better equipped to start with, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? What is it we're trying to deliver for the citizen? And how can we then come up with the ideas as to how that engagement might work and use the tools in the kit bag that the different cloud providers give us to unlock that journey. And we've seen that with the security controls, for example, that allow facial recognition to happen much more easily to give a better citizen experience. And that's what using the power of the cloud, more advanced security posture that you get from that, along with the citizen journey to actually use security to make the citizen journey better, which is really unusual. And I think that's the flip that we need to make. Start with the citizens, start with the innovation type thinking, and the cloud provides very few boundaries now. I think the AI is so powerful within it. I do think to enable that, there's a piece where we need to stop thinking about the technology just as being part of the IT function, and particularly with AI, take a top-down and bottom-up approach so that the organisation throughout it has an understanding of that power, of that breadth of capability, because that will help unlock some of that creative thinking. We've seen where consistently quite a few of the services we've built in recent years, the AI technology has allowed us then to build more accessible services. You're allowing different inroads into those services for the citizen, for the internal users as well in government. They're not as constrained to the very structured forms that they might have used in the past. And I think that's a really one powerful example of where AI is really changing the citizen experience.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. David or Aaron, do you want to come in quickly on this question around the kind of service that the end user sees before we move on to challenges?
Yeah,
I think.
Sorry, David.
No, go on, Aaron.
Oh, thanks, David. Yeah, a big opportunity that I see is to improve healthcare services, particularly when we think about preventative measures in healthcare. A good example here, we're working with Manchester Met University, who have created an application called FootSnap AI that can identify diabetic foot ulcers. And essentially what this enables to do is by pre-identifying foot ulcers and reducing the identification, which would typically take 3 to 6 weeks, to 20 seconds, it can significantly reduce amputation rates, which costs the NHS about $1 billion a year. So the application of AI across healthcare, I think there's huge opportunity here to help the NHS, particularly accelerating some of the preventative measures. I'll stop there so I give David some time as well.
Thanks, Aaron. I worked with a clinician at Imperial about 3 years ago now to use an algorithm that he'd written, so a piece of AI, if you like, to look at the brain scans of a cohort of 800 MS patients. He had 4 years worth of brain scans. He wanted to take all of those brain scans and apply his piece of AI to them to see if he could forecast or predict or what's the word I'm trying to find? Diagnose, there you go. Diagnose earlier, much earlier signs of MS in that cohort of patients. So I think for me, AI and cloud technology can be used. It's all about the use case. It's all about defining the use case. And I think, to be honest with you, AI has been around since 1967, by the way, so it's not new. Most things in IT are kind of relabeled and rebadged every now and again. Cloud infrastructure isn't new, that's been around a long time as well. But I think what we're doing at the moment and what we're seeing at the moment is far better use of some of these technologies, particularly when it's patient-centric or citizen-centric, and being able to deliver value to patients, citizens, and so on. We've all got smartphones. They've had AI in them for a long, long time. We might not know that, we might not be aware of that, but it's in there. So the technology's been out there for a long time, but sometimes there is a fear factor of the unknown and a fear factor of things that we're not familiar with. But I think as AI grows and develops and we hear about more and more use cases, we'll become more and more familiar with it, and that fear factor might go away a little bit. And I think that's the same thing with cloud. There was a study done about 18 months ago that said of all the organizations globally that could use cloud, about 15% of them were. So there's still an awful lot of people that don't use any cloud infrastructure at all. So if you're a CSP, that's quite heartening.
And of those that are using cloud, there's a big question mark around how they're using it and what value they're seeing and what they're doing with it.
Completely agree, Chris. And I think it comes to a point that's been raised in the chat, right? If you use Office 365 and you have your own data center, you're already in a multi-cloud environment because your own data center is a private cloud and you're using Office 365, which is a public cloud. So you're already using two different compute environments. Let's just call them that as opposed to cloud, because effectively all cloud is a compute environment that isn't in your data center. So putting it at that kind of fundamental basic level, we spend an awful lot of time managing multiple platforms for customers and sending them one bill every month because it just makes the whole engagement process really easy for them. So we can manage their private cloud, our private cloud, and public cloud, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it comes down to partnership and who you work with. But I want to try and kind of continue to remove the fear factor of it and talk a lot more, as we are doing this afternoon, about the benefits of it.
So lots of exciting opportunities then, both from a improving the quality and innovation level of public services, and as was mentioned at the top of the call, the kind of efficiency and productivity of public sector organizations. But I just want to first, by bringing in a question from the chat, Owen Davies asks, isn't the government's cloud adoption too spasmodic and uninformed to have an overall digital transformation strategy? And add to that my own framing, which is thinking a little bit about how successful you think UK public sector has been at adapting to the impact of cloud computing and some of that potential for agility and flexibility that Aislinn was talking about at the start, the transition to a more dynamic as a service, consumption-based model for IT. As David, you said at the top of the call as well, it's been a decade since the cloud first policy, and we've seen how many iterations of procurement frameworks like G-Cloud. So I'm just wondering, perhaps, Aaron, I'll come to you first on this one, how successful you think we've been, not just at adopting cloud in UK public sector, but kind of really adjusting to that change in how tech's being used in the private sector much more successfully.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what lens you look at it, because I think if you look at UK public sector compared to other government internationally, then I would say the UK public sector is fairly progressive. If you compare to commercial industries within the UK, then I'd say slightly behind in some ways. In terms of how have they adapted to more dynamic as a service consumption-based models, I would say from my perspective over the 10 to 15 years, it's fairly mixed. And I'd really put this mostly in the process category, where particularly some of the larger departments find it difficult at first with cross-charging mechanisms for different departments. So the tools are there to provide fairly granular costs, whether it be tools that are inbuilt natively within cloud providers or plenty of third-party tools that are out there in the ecosystem. But I think it's the process side of this change management, which in some cases they really struggle. And I feel there's also a lot of education required on cloud economics and the true cost of on-prem versus cloud. For example, typically in local governments, I see that the electricity bill, for example, isn't within the IT budget. So when they're assessing a move to cloud, it can look unfavorable looking at budgets in isolation. So it's really important that when departments, local governments, NHS trusts look at cloud, they look at it holistically and the total cost of ownership.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Aislinn, do you want to come in on this question around kind of challenges for public sector and how you think we're doing in the UK?
I think it's a real mixed bag. Yeah, there are some departments where we see where they have embraced educating themselves and working with specialists in this field as partners for the longer term. We see real success. The likes of GBSA is a really good example of that, where they migrated to the cloud. They went on a modernization journey. They're still on that continuous improvement program because they see that long-term investment, and then they overlay that with innovative thinking internally, but again, bringing in the specialist skills and educating themselves in what it means to adopt the cloud and getting those financial advantages as well. It takes the department to fully embrace it to get the advantages. We see other areas where actually they just migrate to the cloud and it's a lift and shift, and like you described earlier, I think, David, they don't then get those same benefits. They can see their costs rise, and unless you apply that more strategic thinking and go on the cloud journey, the benefits don't happen. And I do think there's a real mixed bag there. Some departments have embraced it and got those benefits, and there's still quite a lot that are doing that, but in pockets. And that more pervasive adoption, that creative thinking, is still a barrier because of that fear of failure, because of the big projects that so often departments are encouraged to take on because of how they have to procure and budget.
It's interesting you mentioned fear of failure. James has put a question in the chat around how we can share innovative, value-driven approaches that we see in the private sector across the public sector without scaring them off or building up walls because of the perception that private sector thinking isn't relevant here. Johnny, do you want to come in here on this question on how we can break down some of these barriers that we're seeing?
Yeah, well, it was also touching back onto Owen and Phil's points as well, which I think are quite pertinent to the overall question. I don't think there is a particular way to, completely uniform cloud, because as some of the points that have been raised, that like it would be completely inappropriate for us to be able to do that. But I do think, with the cloud first policy, there's a bunch of fairly sensible, pretty good principles that are in there that I guess I would like to see being followed a little bit more than maybe they are doing. So landing zone creations, how do we reduce the repetitive nature of how government departments or ALBs kind of rebuild the same thing multiple times? How do we rethink about how we can structure cross-department teams in delivering services to multiple departments that all kind of look for the same thing? Data Factory is always my go-to example of that, and not particularly just in the public sector, but in different sectors that we've supported. There's about 50-60 different implementations of Data Factory. They all do the same thing. So how do we kind of create this platform service, this enabling team that provides that product mindset service to a particular thing that every government department could potentially take advantage of? And then when you're looking at the ALBs as well, doing it their own way, which is absolutely fine. But if your principles are set that everybody kind of follows, in a guardrail driven way. So guardrail being, you know, kind of common principles and common standards and controls as to how to adopt cloud and how to implement it. I think it could be a really good success for public sector. But I do think we're doing quite well as a nation and as a sector, as a public sector. I get to spend a little bit of time, because we are a global company with other countries, and some of those are just about to start, you know, implementing, you know, a cloud policy, let alone a cloud first policy and then a cloud only policy. So I think we're doing okay, right? It's not all doom and gloom in my opinion.
I'm liking the optimism. Well, I mean,
Yeah,
you know,
well, yeah.
Aaron's answer was fairly optimistic as well. You know, I think it's good to think about what we're judging it against, and also the the type of public sector organization you're talking about when you're thinking about this. David, I want to bring you in on this, but perhaps you can also kind of pivot us to the next question I was going to ask everyone, which was what you'd like to see from government or from local public sector, depending on the use case, in terms of changing policy guidance or changing procurement processes that might help them adapt to that pace of change that we're talking about. And we were just talking in the event yesterday about how even fairly agile private sector businesses can struggle to keep up with the pace of change and to transition from a historical kind of organizational culture where they're thinking in multi-year, transformation projects. So I'm just wondering, what you'd like to see in terms of perhaps different policy guidance or procurement structures or whatever it might be.
So on the previous point, we're very good at cloud compute and adoption of new technologies in pockets. The Southwest, for example, are excellent. Scotland are fantastic. The Welsh, quite frankly, are extraordinary. Some of the stuff that they've had in place, particularly in the health sector for a long time, is way in advance of what we're doing in the rest of Britain. Coming on to the cloud policy stuff, my biggest frustration, one of my really big frustrations at the moment, is that the government's cloud first strategy says public cloud first. Right. The reality is that 70 to 80% of cloud adoption in the UK at the moment is with two providers. Right. That's unhealthy, but that's because they've made it incredibly easy to consume their platform. But quite frankly, that's all they want you to do is to consume it. And to some of the points raised in the chat already, cloud isn't a panacea for everything, right? But multi-cloud might be. An adoption of lots of different types of cloud platforms might be the answer for lots of people. And then the comparison to be drawn between public sector and private sector. If you work in the private sector, let's take an industry, the banking or manufacturing are really, really good examples. Banking specifically, you work in an incredibly aggressive and incredibly competitive environment. And in banking specifically, IT has been seen as an enabler for their organizations for decades. Right, because it simply makes them go faster, deliver better, etc., etc. So if IT infrastructure, as an example, has been seen as an infrastructure provider or a competitive advantage provider, and therefore something that can be relied on to drive your organization forward, then you're going to invest in it. If, to your point, Chris, IT is seen as this black hole that the CFO keeps throwing money at, then it's going to be challenged. And I think there's no better place to describe that than in the public sector and specifically the healthcare sector. Away from the centre, healthcare customers have been saying to me for some time, there's no money attached to doing cloud, right, or being in a cloudy environment. Right. When the government start throwing money at us for doing that, there might be, maybe we might do it. But at the moment, we're just going to stick as we are. Right. And again, I caveat that by saying that that's in pockets. There are pockets in the health sector where, AI has been embraced. Cloud has been embraced. So it's a bit spasmodic. Right. It is a bit all over the place in terms of adoption. But I think a lot of that is down to hand-holding and help and the help that's available. And that doesn't necessarily come from your favorite reseller or your favorite consultancy, because your favorite reseller will resell you something that's simple, which is some public cloud, right? Because that's easy. So I think from a policy perspective, I'd like to see the wording of the policy change slightly, because at the moment I think it's slightly biased towards a different direction. And I'd also like to see procurement rules changed in terms of CapEx and OpEx. And I understand that in our public sector, the biggest challenge is that CFOs understand CapEx and they do understand OpEx, but not when it comes to IT.
Some great points. Aislinn, if I was the Prime Minister and I came to you and I said, you're writing G Cloud 15 and the next cloud policy for the government, what would it say different?
So I think it needs a big picture thinking in there. It's not about the short term immediate delivery of projects. What's the government strategy on sustainability, on building intelligent applications that make a difference to citizens and drive the adoption and the change towards those things in as core to the procurement, not the race to the bottom for a basic service that is just shifted onto a cloud platform. It's really embrace it, drive the innovation, drive the change to citizen experience by looking deliberately at being intelligent as part of these applications, as part of these deliveries, and fundamentally build the sustainability into it and the impact on carbon, because I do think that is a huge part of the journey to green that is underestimated by way of its impact in moving to the cloud.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you read through the principles that are in the cloud policy, sustainability is ominous by its absence as a kind of key metric. Johnny, do you want to come in on this question around what we could do in terms of policy guidance or updating procurement processes?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of build on what Aislinn was saying there. I don't ever really see kind of like a value for money view when going through a procurement process in public sector. It's very much on quality of your response, or have you done this before, or and price, and it's kind of even on most cases, and it leads to kind of like this race to the bottom of how cheap you can potentially make it, which I think that's actually more expensive in the long run, because you kind of deliver a project then and you want to kind of finish that project and move on to the next one. Whereas at KPMG, we're much more product mindset, so much more focused on the outcome. So maybe as part of those principles, when a particular piece of work is going through procurement, we could focus on what the outcome is that it's looking to achieve, if that makes sense, and not just focus on, you know, how cheap we can possibly get this. Because I think more often than not, what we see is rescue deals, or this was out 2 years ago and we're kind of redoing it again. So if you transform more than once, you kind of failed on the first one. So value for money for me is pertinent to anything, any sector, any line of work, and especially when it's public sector money, right? It's taxpayers' money. I think you really want to be able to measure that value for money once that goes into production.
You would hope.
Oh yes, you would hope, and I'm sure it definitely does. Again, going back to David's points around pockets, this is not a everybody is in one boat or the other, but more consistency. And again, going back to Owen's and Phil's points around how do we drive this through principles that we can all kind of be measured against, would be, I think, a really step in the right direction.
Aaron, I want to bring you back in and feel free to comment on this policy guidance and kind of procurement structures question. But I also want to pivot a bit to talk about some of the other challenges. I'm thinking particularly skills that was mentioned at the top of the call, and any other kind of big challenges you can think of that might be holding back. Particularly, I'm thinking of smaller organisations like local councils or schools or NHS trusts that perhaps don't have the resources that the Home Office might have, for example, or the Treasury itself.
Yeah, sure. I guess just final point on the procurement question is, I feel departments should look at more collaborative processes, including proof of value exercises when helping to assess the best cloud, and then also just a rethink about incremental changes or smaller programs versus very large 5 to 10 year programs. And allowing the ability to innovate within these programs, I think would be key. Just on the skills point, many of the cloud providers, including us, provide free access to digital skills to try and help all public sector customers with the adoption curve. I think part of the challenge is very busy civil servants being given opportunity or time to engage in skills. So I certainly think there's an onus back on UK public sector to make room for people to engage in skilling that it's available. I think there's an onus on cloud providers to increasingly work with higher ed facilities to embed skills in student programs, and equally in things like apprenticeship schemes and programs where working with various organizations to help provide them the skills when coming into the workforce, because then that provides a more affordable workforce for some of these smaller departments who are, often competing with commercial organizations to bring in people with, cloud experience and digital experience.
Aislinn, I want to come to you on this question around skills, and I'm thinking not just in terms of the technical skills that you might need to implement a cloud solution, because you can do that in partnership with your cloud provider or a managed service provider, but also that kind of broader digital literacy that we need to do the organizational change that you were talking about at the start of the call, right? And the kind of the part 2 of the cloud transformation journey.
Yeah, I think there's a significant journey to still go on there. To be fair, similar to David's point earlier, or I think what you have said, Jonathan, the UK are rating of global skill more advanced than many other countries, so we should be kind to ourselves at the same time. But I think there is a very mixed level of understanding of what the art of the possible is, and it can look very easily like a dark art because we don't have the skills, and then that leads to the fear of change, the fear of having to adopt. We could see really clearly, actually, over the last year with the level of generative AI conversations. I had to have generative AI in this conversation somewhere. That whenever we talk about it with technology first, that tends to stunt the conversation. It leads to just the specialists having that conversation in isolation. Whereas if we can help across the organizations understand a basic level of what this technology is for, and then have the conversation about what are the problems, how can we solve them through technology, it's a completely different conversation. So I think there is a base level of understanding that's needed, and I think that is across whole organization. It's not, so I agree with your point, Darren, on educating at a higher education level, those individuals coming into our organizations, but right from the top of the organization, understanding how do you run a digital program? What does good look like? How does this technology make a difference, and how do you assess value from it is incredibly important. And all of those things lead to that, those better outcomes, better impact.
You're on mute, Chris.
Wait, you're on mute, Chris.
Oh, apologies. I want to come to Johnny and David on this, but I'm also really conscious we're running out of time. So I want to flag a couple of questions from the chat, or a couple of points from the chat. Helen made a point which I think resonates really well with some of the points that have already been made around the kind of gut funding being available for CapEx projects. And Neil was talking about, funding being available for large projects. So I'm wondering whether you've got any thoughts on either the challenges we've already discussed, or the kind of way that funding is structured to make it easier to use. Johnny?
Well, so I don't want to be the facilitator here, but I met David for the first time a couple of days ago, and I think he's got a way better answer than I do on the CapEx OpEx thing. So I'm happy to
pass it over.
It's the mic to you, David, on that one.
Yes, funding. The way that public sector funding, unfortunately, is structured at the moment means that an awful lot of people will try and capitalize everything, certainly at the CFO level. The reality is that the CFOs in trusts, in local authorities, in higher education, understand the difference between OpEx and CapEx. Clearly they do. I wouldn't be, rude enough to suggest they didn't. However, they tend to associate those procurement methods with different things. And very often I find in the public sector that they don't associate OpEx models with IT procurement, because their IT departments are very, very adept at going out and spending capital to acquire IT assets. And the challenge with that is that comes back to this cost modeling thing. If you don't cost model your IT infrastructure, to the minutiae that you should do to understand the delta and the difference in cost between on-prem, CapEx, IT infrastructure and cloud, then you really won't see the value in cloud directly, because you don't understand the difference, commercial difference between the two well enough to be able to judge whether or not one's better than the other. So that's a real challenge. I had a conversation with a very famous university not that long ago, and he said, I've got £150,000 to spend on some new compute and storage, so I'm going to go out and buy some hardware. I said, have you looked at cloud? He said, I have, and it's too expensive. And when we worked out the maths, the capital cost over a 4-year life cycle was twice as much as the monthly payment for the cloud infrastructure equivalent. But that's because he hadn't looked at the whole life cost of the infrastructure. He'd looked at the procurement cost of the hardware and the software. So I think all of that cost modeling is really, really important. The final piece I want to say on this is really around, and apologies, Jonathan, but I'm going to say around public sector's typical favorite consultancies who will go in and talk to them about cost modeling around these things, but they won't actually deliver potentially the outcome post that consulting engagement. And the only reason I mention that is because I talked to an ambulance trust recently who said, we've just paid £400,000 for an IT infrastructure report to talk about cloud, but now we're just left with a report. We now have to do something about that, because now we're complicit in our own knowledge and understanding of the savings we could make if we went to cloud, but we can't do that because we don't have any cloud skills. Whereas if we'd have engaged with you, you could have done the consulting for us, then architected a solution, and then migrated us to that solution, because you do the whole thing. So I think it comes down to engagement with maybe different partners, not your traditional partners, but just looking at the landscape of who you can work with a little more broadly than perhaps you do at the moment.
I feel like I've got to offer Johnny a right to reply.
No, I fully agree. I think it depends on the partner, right? That's very much an output approach to a problem, which I agree with David. It doesn't sound like it would have given me a huge, go back to the point I was making earlier, value for money. I quite like the fact that we've got an end-to-end practice which can provide that rationalization view of what the tech estate looks like and provide multiple options, right? Going back to the point, is it fully cloud? Is it hybrid cloud? Is it multi-cloud? It all depends on what the organization's outcomes need to be. It all pins back to how the organization is structured, what the culture looks like, what skills they have. Are they able to kind of take this forward once insert supplier has delivered this to them? And then again, going back to that point around, we talked about procurement processes and being able to measure the value for money of something. How is the delivery going to be sustainable for that particular business? Is it going to need to, take on additional heads or managed service contracts, etc.? So I fully agree with what David said there. I think it's a better understanding of what your partners are capable of, and the cheapest is not always the right option in my experience.
Yeah, as someone said in the chat earlier, it's not how much you're spending, it's how effectively you're spending it, right? Unfortunately, we're almost pretty much out of time. As always with these discussions, I find we just barely getting going, barely scratching the surface. But I think we've had a really interesting discussion this afternoon. I've got one last question, if I may, very briefly for the panel. And perhaps, Aaron, I'll come to you first. If you think of a public sector organisation in your mind, it can be large central government organisation or a smaller local organisation. If you could give one key bit of advice to a public sector leader thinking of undertaking a cloud modernisation project to help them get it right, if you could wave your magic wand and make sure that this was the one thing they would really understand, well, what would it be?
Yeah, I think it's don't just focus on the delivery of a technology program, ensure that you look holistically across the people process side of it as well. That, the cost and impact of change will always be the biggest factor in adopting cloud. And I think it was in the comments, be really clear on what you're trying to achieve. Don't just do cloud for cloud's sake. Huge amount of benefits, but you need to be clear from the outset of what you're trying to achieve and who you want to work with to achieve that.
And David?
Partnership. If you're going into something that is new and is unknown to your organization or unfamiliar to your organization, it has to be around the people that you partner with and the people that you pick up the phone to and say, look, I don't understand this. Come and explain it to me. I'll give you an example. Somebody about a week ago said to me, David, can I buy an AI? And I said, well, no, not really. And they said, well, everybody's talking to me about AI. Okay, but what are they talking to you about? Well, you know, how amazing it is. Okay, well, look, let's understand the subject first and the fact that you can't buy an AI, right? It's not a thing. It's not like a laptop. So for me, it's about engaging with people that do actually understand some of this stuff, do understand the things that you feel challenged by, and being a little bit brave and sticking your hand up and going, I don't get this. Can you come and explain it to me? And people like me are free. So I love having those conversations all day.
Well, perhaps they can call you straight after the webinar. Johnny?
Yeah. I think I just wanted to build on Aaron's point. Really, it's don't underestimate the importance of a culture shift along with a cloud modernization program. There's a whole host of skills, people, methodologies, what that old IT team who used to watch the green lights flash wants to become, which is an enabling part of that particular organization. I think a lot of our clients have missed on that culture shift. Accountability is one that I always talk about as well. Making sure that the right people have the right level of accountability, so things are not kind of lost in the ether. So two technically, but hopefully that's okay.
Great. And Aislinn, I'll give you the final word.
Brilliant. And I'd probably echo some of what's been said there. I think partnerships are absolutely the key. Do not do it by yourself, but also don't try to farm out the risk. Don't try to farm out the whole project end to end. I think if you're really going to have success here, there's a recognition that the department, the organization needs to change as well. So going into partnership with one or multiple organizations is not just about building the technology, but the skills, the specialisms that can also enable you as an organization and support you in going through that journey of change, not just a journey of technology adoption.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to end on. We're out of time, unfortunately, so huge thanks to the panel. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Don't forget to check out the rest of the great Cloud Week content that we've got coming out this week on techUK, and I'll see you in the next webinar. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the audience for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.